Hello, everybody.
Hello.
We are live streaming from
Yeah.
Connecticut.
I'm private.
Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the third lecture of Decoloniality Now online lecture series on interdisciplinary perspectives on coloniality and decoloniality. Today, Professor César Abadía-Barrero and Professor Camilo Ruiz from the University of Connecticut, USA, will deliver a lecture on collective healing of war wounds through art in Colombia. So they will present a community-oriented approach. Cesar is a Colombian academic and activist. He has been a professor of anthropology, human rights, and public health at different universities, including the Universidad Nacional de Colombia and currently the University of Connecticut. He is a member of Red Salud Paz, a network of universities and civil society organizations that support the peace accord in Colombia. He has conducted various participatory action research and multi-method research projects on health and social security programs and policies, and the right to health, social mobilization, and decolonial health. He is currently studying the relationships between process of capital accumulation and the destruction of human biology, and is conducting research with indigenous and peasant Amazonian communities, especially on Buen Vivir, like good living. He directs the Buen Vivir and Collective Healing Initiative, which seeks to support initiatives in which rituals, arts, and ancestral knowledge heal colonial bonds. And you will hear from Cesar more about these activities. And Camilo is an assistant professor at the University of Connecticut. He's an anthropologist with more than 15 years of experience in ethnographic and anthropological work in urban contexts, both in Colombia and the United States. He uses the combined strengths of participatory action research, anthropology, public health, and the arts to engage in collaborative research, which often he describes, which often overlooked communities. Yeah, his current work actually sheds light on the growing opioid epidemic in urban Colombia through the gaze and narratives of impoverished heroin users navigating pleasure, pain, addiction, limited access to opioid replacement therapy, homelessness, and stigma. Camilo has also researched the dynamics of Latinx communities settling in new growth communities in the United States Midwest. He's expanding his research also to other parts like Northeast, where impoverished migrants give life to the crumbling cities they call home, while transforming them into globalized multicultural spaces. So Camilo is now building a participatory action research lab. So that will serve the city, many cities in Connecticut, like Hartford, Connecticut, to dig deeper into phenomenon from a bottom-up collaborative perspective. Now I'd like to invite Cesar and Camilo to deliver their lecture. Please.
Thank you very much, Erku, and thank you everyone for joining. We know it's currently later approaching the evening in Germany, so we really appreciate everybody here. So we're gonna start sharing the presentation, and we'll go ahead with the lecture.
Do you all see our presentation in full screen mode?
Yes, that's good.
Perfect.
Wonderful, thank you. If at some point, since we won't be able to see the chat or something. If there is a problem at some point, please just unmute and let us know. So this is the title of our presentation for today. As you heard, Camilo and I are both from Colombia and have been working there for a long time. So we're going to talk about this particular project of collective healing of war wounds through art and the kinds of community-oriented work that we've been doing there. Okay, next. So you might know that Colombia came to the spotlight of human rights discussions as it entered the list of countries that aimed to build peace after decades of war. The 2016 peace accord between the Colombian government and the FARC-EP guerrilla aimed to put an end to 52 years of armed conflict that left over 8 million victims, roughly 15% of the country's population. A joint effort between the Truth Commission, its full name being Commission for the Clarification of Truth, Coexistence, and No Repetition, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, and the Human Rights Data Analysis Group estimated that between 1985 and 2016, 450,066 people were killed, 120,768 were forcibly displaced, over 50,000 were kidnapped, over 16,000 were children and adolescents were recruited, and around 8 million people were forcibly displaced. 90% of the victims were civilians. During the 4 years in which the FARC-EP and the government negotiated the accord in Havana, delegates considered the lessons learned from previous peace accords and their aftermaths, knowing that a long-lasting peace and reconciliation needs to navigate a range of challenges behind the meanings, expectations, and scope of truth and transitional justice. 60 victims or survivors that reflected the universe of victims and victimizing events were selected to play an important role in the peace process, shaping the negotiations that were happening in Havana and the contents of the accord. In peace studies and transitional justice discussions, the scholars advocate for a complementary balance between truth and justice that needs to include harsh topics such as amnesties and reduced sentences. In the words of 2 victims that were delegates at the negotiations table, these seemingly irreconcilable discussions were evident. While the first person was driven by finding the truth, disregarding the role of punishments or compensations, the second person you will hear about acknowledged that the peace goal might trump justice, but without impairing their dignity. The first person said, "Prison for 40 or 50 years isn't going to bring back my son, and nor will a check from the government for millions of pesos. I base my vision of justice on knowing the real truth and the facts of what happened, knowing what they did, why they did it, and who the violence favored." The second person said, "The justice we seek as victims is not an unmovable righteousness that obstructs the peace process. I believe that peace has to be greater than the desire for justice. However, it must also achieve a delicate balance. We cannot attain such a low level of justice that it impairs the dignity of victims." And this picture that you're seeing here is from an acclaimed photographer in Colombia, Jesus Abad Colorado, and you're going to see another picture of him that became emblematic of the war in Colombia. Indeed, victims of the armed conflicts have different ideas of what justice and peace means when they accept to retell their painful stories, and the perpetrators who have come to the negotiation table agree to turn in their arms and offer their confessions if transitional justice mechanisms include amnesties and reduced sentences. To add to the difficulties of what comes during the negotiation process and after the signing of peace accord, questions and decisions involves the types of reparations that are considered adequate to each group of victims and according to each individual story, as well as the kinds of punishments that perpetrators should receive according to their rank and their role on the different crimes they committed. For the Colombian peace process, it was decided that two newly created bodies should work independently. The Special Jurisdiction for Peace was created to try the war crimes and crimes against humanity of the many perpetrators, including the guerrilla, the paramilitary groups, and the state. It is estimated that paramilitary groups killed 45% of the victims, while the guerrillas were responsible for 27% of the murders, and state agents for 12%. An important innovation of the Colombian Peace Accord was that Colombians should be granted the right of no repetition, meaning a future without war. Assuring no repetition obligated the new truth, justice, and reparations mechanisms to address the historical root causes of the conflict, which demanded addressing both civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights, given that violence oftentimes have socioeconomic origins. Indeed, Colombia's history of dispossession, land grabbing, and immense inequalities is also the result of a problematic partnership between governmental elites, landowners, and transnational corporations and industries, which some argue are the reasons why farmers were forced to take up arms in the first place, and why, years later, guerrillas and paramilitaries had easy access to new recruits. The Truth Commission produced 11 massive volumes dealing with layers of explanations of the armed conflict, from the general level, structural and historical causes, all the way to personal narratives of victims of the armed conflict. It included accounts of the 14 victimizing acts committed by the different actors: forced disappearances, kidnappings, forced recruitment, forced displacement, torture, sexual abuse, selective assassinations and homicide, arbitrary detention, massacres, extrajudicial executions, confinement, forced labor, and exile. Given that in violence and peace-building studies, it is recognized that numbers and individual stories play important and complementary roles, the Colombian peace process paid special attention to testimonies, with one of the volumes of the Truth Commission presenting minimally edited testimonies. However, as a legacy of a technology of colonial rule, human rights law imposed the modern European white language and construction of justice that reifies an individual juridical human and forecloses other scenarios of the human. As such, the handling of testimonies under a human rights framing turns them into institutional or historical archives that are organized, codified, and classified in a way that they render some accounts of violence intelligible, while others remain elusive.
So here you can see a snapshot of many of the volumes that were produced, the ones that we are talking about. So archives serve as vessels or receptacles, storing information and memories across various forms. In transitional moments, such as Colombia's space-building process, diverse types of archives have emerged to document testimonies from decades of violence. However, archives often struggle to break free from institutional state and colonial epistemologies and frameworks, as well as their inherently human-centered architectures. As archival scholars like Foucault and Anne Stoller have highlighted, archives inherently raise questions of accessibility and inclusion. Even when designed to be public, archives rely on selection processes that are frequently governed by elite groups. These processes, guided by specific criteria and categories, can exclude the voices, media, objects, or testimonies of lay people. For example, while the 11 volumes of the Truth Commissions are invaluable records of Colombia's armed conflict, the reliance on written language as the primary medium of preservation and communication may limit their reach and inclusivity. Furthermore, archives are not merely repositories of facts. They are also spaces where emotions are recorded, preserved, and showcased. In Colombia, as in other societies navigating transitional justice processes, archives take on various forms: books, museums, databases, and public art installations. These mediums serve not only to document the past, but also to process and memorialize the pain, reconciliation, and hope tied to the prospect of moving forward. Capturing and recording the emotions of victims and perpetrators thus becomes a task mediated by the state's memory apparatus, which plays a crucial role in shaping how collective and individual experiences are remembered. So you may be familiar with this iconic piece made by Doris Salcedo, which is perhaps one of the most famous conceptual artists from Colombia, which created, after the peace agreement, this monument, which is called a counter monument, in fact, made with arms and guns that were donated by the FARC guerrilla. And later they were funded, melted, and later kind of like imprinted by hand by female victims of the armed conflict. And in fact, you can go and visit the art piece and kind of like a step on it and kind of like feel kind of like the pains and trajectories of victims throughout the Colombian armed conflict. The art piece is located in Bogota's downtown. In Colombia, the National Center of Historical Memory leads much of this work, the work of like holding all this memory of the war, right? And is the public institution that was created to do so. Established to manage historical documentation, foster understanding, and promote non-repetition, the center has undertaken an impressive array of initiatives to ensure that the atrocities of the past are neither forgotten nor repeated. However, the magnitude and the gruesome impact of the violence that happened over generations is impossible to record in its totality, and as an institution, it is biased and constrained to rules and formats that do not always allow other forms of archiving memory to emerge under its control. In this sense, Casa Común, the project that we are going to share with you today, emerges as an archive that contests many forms of creating, arranging, managing, and presenting a collection of pre- and post-war memories of victims of an armed conflict.
So this is the region where we are working. You have the Colombian map, and in the red is this state jurisdiction we called department. It's called Caquetá, and the different areas. And on the left, you will see Florencia, which is the capital, and that's mostly the area, the primary area where we were working with people that suffered various forms of the kinds of atrocities we commented before, and the majority of them were displaced to this area. It's a very area very important ecologically because it's in the Piedmont where the Andes Mountains meet the Amazonian forest. So it's one of the most biodiverse regions in the country, and Colombia being the second most biodiverse regions in the world. So this is important to understand. Well, we'll talk also about the importance of nature and the references of nature in this work. So we've been working there, and in many peace-building efforts, these areas become sort of known nationally and internationally as the epicenters of peace building. So you start seeing a lot of state and international humanitarian organizations paying attention to these areas and channeling a lot of funds to build peace. And so we notice in many interactions, one of our colleagues, Vanessa Giraldo, that seeds, small plants, and recipes were exchanged constantly by survivors of the armed conflict. And perhaps one of the most important significant symbols of the peace building was an organization of former combatants and victims that after years of meetings and distrust came together to propose a business for the production and commercialization of Amazonian floral essence that could heal the body and the spirit. And this was a women's-led organization. Besides the no-repetition principle of the peace accord, another exciting development was the incorporation of Buen Vivir as a guiding principle. Buen Vivir is an Andean indigenous epistemology that gained traction across Latin America in the last decades and made its way to the peace accord thanks to the tenacious work of indigenous and Afro-descendant communities that argued for ecocentric models of a harmonious life in which nature is protected and nurtured. Buen Vivir has gained political and discursive prominence as a decolonial practice or alternative developmental paradigm guided by ancestral knowledge. Excitedly, thanks to social movements, Buen Vivir was incorporated as a principle in the Ecuadorian and Bolivian plurinational constitutions. Unfortunately, there is a growing consensus that the leftist progressive governments that supported the inclusion of Buen Vivir co-opted this indigenous life principle to advance a modernizing agenda via exploitation of natural resources, which contradicts the protection of Mother Earth. We quickly realized that for most, if not all of the women participating in Casa Común, Buen Vivir was an abstract concept that didn't mean much. Equally, we noticed that probably nobody had ever been to a museum, and that even photography, a medium we initially thought we could use, didn't seem like the best artistic strategy for people to express themselves. We shifted a bit the orientation and decided to briefly discuss what made our lives beautiful. By adding signifiers to that future possibility of a beautiful life and how we dream about it, then their ideas of Buen Vivir started to emerge. We asked them to draw or write whatever emerged in their hearts to tell their story, not from the suffering they had all experienced, but from the dreams and hopes they all had for a future in which life was beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Now we want to walk you through kind of like briefly through a process of this collective art piece and how we made it. It's called Casa Común. So we had Casa Común consisted basically of 3 workshops. All were conducted in the city of Florencia, in Caquetá. And in this first workshop that César was already describing, of course, the first thing that was kind of like made was this ritual of like making peace with nature and kind of like making peace with all the elements and the people that were present. And then people, mostly women, started to kind of like sketch this idea of how to live in peace with nature and humans. And that was kind of like the main kind of like resource that we had to conceptualize the art piece. At this moment, after this first workshop, we invited an artist that kind of like allowed us to kind of like give a whole kind of like to materialize the concept. But let me show you kind of like some of the drawings that or the sketches that came out of that first workshop. Here you can see people being displaced by war, and they always kind of like were talking about the before and after of that moment of displacement. Just to tell you, Florencia in Caquetá, 80%, more or less 80% of the people that today live in the city have been displaced by war in the last decades. Also, there were a lot of references to animals, plants, and the possibility to kind of like nurture life in the place where you live, right? And there was this longing for those places, those farms that were close to healthy waters in which like food and animals and plants could kind of like thrive more or less easily. Here again, like nature thriving and living close to nature that is healthy, right? So here is Paola Gamboa, who is a key actor in this whole process. And she's a professor of art in the local university in Florencia, who has been working with local communities and women's organizations for various years now. And when we invited her to participate in the project, she was excited about it. And when she saw all these sketches, she thought very adequately that people were dreaming about a house that was communal, a house in which nature had a space in which, of course, peace was a constant feeling, in which like happiness was present, in which food was present. And she came up with this a structure, which is a cube that was going to have an entrance and like walls, of course, and the walls were going to be composed of individual art pieces that were going to be kind of like crafted in these embroidery drums, right? And also the house was going to have 3 windows that would look at the 3 main important rivers of this city. As Cesar was mentioning before, the city is in the Piedmont, and the rivers that flow from the Andes to the lower part of these like Amazonian forest are amazing, and people love these rivers. Of course, they are endangered rivers, like they're losing a lot of water, they're getting poisoned. So it was also an homage to those rivers, right? And just to mention, each art piece, each embroidery drum would have like 2 faces. One face, as you see, would have flowers to kind of like convey the idea that houses in Florencia and in this area of Colombia always have flowers and plants outside. Plants that even can be used that can have medicinal uses, right? Not only ornamental uses. And in the other side of the piece, people would kind of like develop more in detail their own ideas of how is to live in peace with nature and society. This was the second workshop. People were very excited. They took materials home and they started to craft kind of like their embroidery drums at home with the help of Paola. Paola was always kind of like supporting them via WhatsApp, or because she lives there, people would go and visit her in their house and they would troubleshoot techniques, etc., right? And the last third workshop was like a 3-day workshop in a finca, like in a recreational house close to Florencia, and all participants were able to join, even if they didn't have childcare. Their children were welcome. And during this long weekend, we kind of like prepare a space in which we could have fun, in which people could feel they were being cared. So there was like a temazcal, this kind of like ancestral sweat lodge architectural space. There was a mud pool. There was also another pool. We had amazing food. There were kind of like spaces to talk, to rest, but also we used some of the time to kind of like craft perhaps 80% of the art piece. So people, they came with the homework very well advanced, but during these 3 days, we kind of like managed to kind of almost finish the art piece. So you see people here kind of like chilling, enjoying the mud pool, and you see people here working as well. And here we want to share with you, and we're gonna kind of like be silent for less than a minute to show you like the first kind of like assemblage of this house in that country house or recreational house. So let me.
So we curated a catalog that has accompanied Casa Común in many venues where it has been showcased in Colombia, the United States, and Canada. The power of each individual piece is undeniable, and we had a hard time curating the pieces that would make the final exhibit, given that many women produced multiple pieces of art. And yet, there was something powerful about the collective experience and in the collective message that Casa Común was transmitting. While each brick of the house represented an individual work and had a particular title and description, there was something about working alongside fellow women, a sorority, that made the work more intense and at the same time more bearable. Pains and narratives of war, human rights violations, and peace building started to echo each other, bringing a level of intensity that transcended each individual account to compose a collective message that was beautifully overwhelming. Women would repeatedly thank each other for being there and said that they wouldn't have been able to do it if it were not for the support of the other women. Embroidering the pain and the ideas had been as painful as it had been therapeutic, but knowing that their loved friends were by their side, offering support, made them stronger. They had hurt each other many times and supported each other many times, but this time it felt different. Being able to do and enjoy their art had been important. However, being able to take time from their busy lives to be together and aiding in the process of transforming each other's pains into art had helped them in their always unfinished healing journeys. War wounds, they explain, never go away, but life can go on a little lighter. These are some examples so that you can get an idea of the art and the stories behind them, and then we'll turn into our conclusion. Audrey Jorleni Leal created a warrior uterus. Andri shared, I have heard many stories from my grandmother. I wanted to depict a uterus with red colors that signify pain. I wanted to depict the women who were displaced, often alone with 3 or 4 children. The uterus and the fallopian tubes represent the women who have to leave their homes with their children and who, in spite of all the pain, want to go forward for and with them. And it was clear, according to many, that nature had also been a victim of the armed conflict. Rubiela Pogimui's piece titled Flower Chains represents how, quote, nature and our lands have also been affected and saddened by the armed conflict. The birds, the trees, the flowers also died with explosions of the bombs, unquote. Her 14-year-old son, Alexander, did a piece titled Black and White Drawing, in which he depicts, quote, how the trees were left because of the smoke, bombs, and gunshots that multiplied during the armed conflict. They destroyed the environment, the trees, the birds, the people. During the war, desolation is everywhere. The connections between war, nature, and healing were represented by many, both symbolically and literaturely. For example, Lilia Giraldo Murillo's piece is titled Hen. Her description reads, quote, I was a victim of sexual abuse, torture, and displacement in 2002. I made a hen with a lot of love and care to heal my wounds a little, end quote. In the catalog, we summarized how Jenny Tatiana Grisales described her piece titled My Healing. I am a victim of the armed conflict, and I embroidered a basil, which is an aromatic and healing plant. We use it for any pain. It is a very important plant for our home. For me, it represents the healing of many wounds I had in the past.
Well, so now we will go to our conclusion. Healing to some extent took the form of art in private and collective time spaces that feel very intimate. However, the making of Casa Común brought a collective and caring sense of time and space that allowed for the emotional labor in the aftermath of the peace accord to be materialized. Thanks to carving out time and spaces filled with care, the women continued elaborating, processing, and healing the many complexities of the war and the seemingly inefficient evolution of the peace accord. This circularity of time defies Western lineal conceptions such as those used to think about transitional justice and invites to think of healing through the circularity of ancestral time. When vivir was, is, and can be, despite the terrors of war, at the same time, when vivir has always been threatened. It is both a condition of existence and a possibility. It is a past, present, and future conditioned by innumerable waves of violence and peace building. Casa Común materializes ideas of future and peace that do not necessarily align with ideas of justice and reparation promoted by the state and the law. However, this collective and emotional work does support those who seek justice and reparation. Victims have adopted psychosocial tropes to describe the work they do to support one another. However, Casa Común felt less institutionalized and more organic to the rhythms of everyday life that dance through pains and joys, demands for justice and struggles to survive, and painful memories mixed with joys that add layers of tears and laughter to the many households and spaces where these women and their Casa Común circulate. Collective healing, just like peace building, is slow and happens in the everyday dynamics that allow for pains and hopes to continue coexisting, but little by little with more spaces for happiness and joyfulness. The creation of Casa Común was deeply rooted in the longest-standing Global South tradition of participatory action research. This approach emphasizes that personal and social transformation is achievable through a collective, community-based research process that provides the time and space to reflect on pressing issues. In this case, the collective of community artists in the process of using art to reflect about their arduous trajectories within the armed conflict had time to meditate about their lives, and that felt unique and special because their daily lives are very intense because of the continuous violence, displacements, and the precarious jobs they managed to get. Casa Común also drew upon feminist approaches, making reflexivity a core aspect of the process. This included a continuous examination of power dynamics, particularly those related to gender and social status. Beyond feminist theory, Casa Común embodied a distinctly feminine ethos. Most of the community artists were mothers, sisters, and daughters, which used gendered skills to create artistic pieces of memory and longing. Care, love, and patience were constant elements and feelings that nurtured the whole process, and that set of emotions and affections are palpable when witnessing the art installation. The collective of women brought as key actor nature as fundamental presence that helped connect emotionally with their memories, with one another, and with the art. The presence of many other than human beings also invites to rethink constructions of healing and of reparations. People and nature need to be healed is perhaps one of the central messages of Casa Común. And for that process to happen, people need time to be together and build together memories of hopes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, César. Thank you very much, Camilo, for this really touching, insightful, and colorful presentation.